The red-eyed tree frog, one of my absolute favorite frog species in the entire world, and 2 weeks ago I was finally able to get 2 of them. I had been searching for months and came across a few, but nothing was working out, until March 25th when I finally came across these guys. These frogs look amazing, but they'll look even better in an awesome enclosure, and that's exactly what I'm going to make them. Like usual, I'll start with a 40-gallon breeder that I'll convert into a vertical enclosure. I recommend you check out my video on this if you haven't already. This one will be a bit different though, as I'll have to remove the top of the enclosure. The reason for this is because I'll be using ceramic heat emitters as a heat source, and if set on glass, they could shatter it. I started by cutting the silicone and using a glass cutter on the top. This ended up not working, so I had to smash it with a hammer. Not the best option, but whatever I needed to do to get it done. Once all the glass was removed, I was left with a completely open top. However, I'll need to make a screen lid to replace it. I started by measuring the inside of the enclosure and then cutting some window screen frame to size. I've been using this window screen method for a while now, and it's a cheap and easy way to make a DIY mesh lid. Anyway, once all the pieces were cut, I filed down the sharp edges. Once all the pieces were filed, I assembled them and used some spline to attach mesh. Like I said earlier, this is a cheap and easy way to make a mesh lid. I've been using it for around 4 years now, and I've never had a single problem with it. Anyways, after the mesh was attached and the excess was cut off, I attached it to the top of the tank using 100% silicone. Now that it's attached, here's a final look. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out, but this alone won't retain enough humidity, so I'll add a piece of polycarbonate to the back later on. Next I need to make the background. I'll start by using XPS foam like usual and drawing a pattern on. I tried to make a different pattern than usual since I was kind of getting sick of the old one, but I wasn't happy with it, so I changed it before going over it with a wire brush drill bit. Like usual, I carved over the outlines of the pattern and then in between them. I've been thinking of some new background techniques lately, but I want to know what's out there, so if you have any suggestions, let me know down in the comments. My main problem with this background is that it's very time consuming and also lacks a variation in color and texture. I could just fix that issue by carving it and painting it differently, but that would add even more to the time it takes. Anyway, after carving in between the pattern, I started to add texture. The texture on this one is basically the same as the one I made for my crested gecko, but I'll use a different color palette to paint it later. Once I got everything carved, it was time to start painting. To do that, I'll be using white tintable Drylock and concrete pigments. Like always, I start with a thick dark gray base coat. The reason I use such a dark and thick base coat is to really get in all the cracks and bring out the texture. After covering it in the base coat, I started to add the second coat. This coat is basically the same thing, except I'm not forcing it into the cracks. Then as I go on, I'll use progressively lighter dry brush coats, which brings me to my next coat. I'll be using a slightly lighter color and using a dry brush technique so that it only hits the edges of the pattern. After applying it to the whole background, I did the same thing with an even lighter color. Once all the coats were on and everything was dry, I could attach it to the tank. Again, I'm using 100% silicone that I spread all over the back of the tank. Once the surface had been covered, I put the background in the enclosure and pressed it into place. Then I repeated the process on the left and right sides. You can see that this background doesn't go all the way to the bottom, and that's because it'll be covered in substrate. Like I said earlier, this background is very time consuming, so anytime I can get away with doing less, I will. On one piece it's not that much of a difference, but when you're doing 3 like this, it really helps. After applying the background and letting the silicone cure overnight, I ran silicone along the corners. I do this to help blend them together. Once the silicone was applied, I ran my finger along it to smooth it out. After that, I applied Drylock using the same technique as the background to add color. Once all that was done, that finished the background. I'm really happy with the way this one turned out. The next thing I need to do is scape it. I didn't end up filming this process because for the first time ever, a scape only took me 2 minutes. There are a few sharp parts that I'll cut off with some wire cutters, as well as silicone the wood to the background. The wood probably would have been fine on its own as it's a tight fit, but I didn't want to take any chances. I wanted to paint this silicone, but I wasn't able to because I ran out of Drylock, so I'll cover it with moss later. Anyways, before I add the false bottom and the substrate, I need to vacuum out extra foam. For the false bottom, I'll be using Seachem fluorite for lack of better materials. I've had this bag sitting in my closet for months now, and I figured it was about time I use it. I would have rather used something like Leica, but this will work for now. Once the drainage layer was in place, I added a piece of mesh to separate it from the substrate. Once the mesh was in place, I added some charcoal. This helps absorb water as well as prevent odor and bacteria buildup. This is normally the part where I'd add springtails, but I wasn't able to get any at the time, but I'll definitely add some later on. After putting in a decent amount of charcoal, it was time to add the substrate. This is just a standard ABG mix made of 1 part cocoa fiber, 1 part reptile bark, 1 part play sand, and 2 parts sphagnum moss. This substrate will be perfect and retain humidity well. I also wasn't able to get any isopods, so I'll add them when I can. Anyway, the next thing to do is add the plants. Like I've shown in the past, I remove them from their pots and break up the dirt from the roots. A lot of these plants you won't see in the final design. The reason for this is because I've only ever set up a few completely terrestrial setups, and I'm still trying to figure out what plants work and which ones don't. A lot of times I use a plant in one tank and it thrives, and other times I use it in a tank with similar temperature, humidity, and substrate, and it just doesn't do as good. I didn't show it, but I washed all the excess soil off the roots of the plants. After all the plants were prepped, it was time to add them to the enclosure. Like I said earlier, you'll see a bunch of plants that didn't end up being in the final design. I started with this umbrella plant. This is one of the ones that I had to replace because it wasn't doing so well. Whenever I replace a plant like this, I try to make sure that it's the same shape and size as the previous one. This is so that I can minimize the amount of other plants I have to move to make room for them. Red-eyed tree frogs love hanging out on large leaves, so I made sure to provide plenty of those for them. As with the mossy frog tank, some of the plants weren't planted directly into soil, so I covered their roots in sphagnum moss. At this point I was very happy with the way things were going, and I was very sad to lose some of these plants. I also decided to add a few bromeliads for a pop of color. All of the bromeliads weren't planted directly into soil, so I had to cover the roots in sphagnum moss. Bromeliads are one of my absolute favorites, if not my absolute favorite to use in an enclosure. I've used them in 3 different kinds of environments, and I've had major success in all 3. The way they look and the pop of color they provide, it's just amazing. If you want to make any enclosure look instantly tropical, bromeliads are the way to go. Not to mention there's so many different varieties of them. This tank was fairly hard to plant because the scape was so intricate, but I had fun doing it. As some of you might know, planting a tank is my absolute favorite part of any setup. I had to support some of the plants like this bromeliad on the bottom left with a few zip ties. Something like thread or fishing line would also be a great way to do this. Once all the planting was done, I added in their water bowl. Nothing huge, just enough for them to sit in. I also added lots of leaf litter. After all, no vivarium's complete without it. Now that all that's taken care of, I need to address lighting. For that, I'll use my usual light. For heating, I'll use 2 ceramic heat emitters with temperature probes connecting to temperature controlling thermostats on the outside. I have one for daytime temperature and one for nighttime. A naturalistic red-eyed tree frog enclosure. Although it's been through a lot in terms of plants, I'm really happy with the end product. The way all the plants complement each other, and the pops of color from the bromeliads, everything's perfect. The frogs love hanging out on the large leaves, as well as the bromeliads. I've set up enclosures similar to this in the past, but nothing has felt more tropical. I really hope all these plants make it long term, because I absolutely love them. We'll see how things turn out though. For now, I'll just sit back and enjoy this enclosure. I want to know what you guys think about it, so let me know down in the comments. Like I said in my previous video, I am absolutely beyond excited to finally have these amazing frogs. I'd been wanting red-eyed tree frogs for so long, and to finally get them is a dream come true. Everything about them, from their coloration to their behavior, is just amazing. Also, I still don't have names for these guys, so if you've got any ideas, please let me know. Anyways, that's gonna do it for this one. I hope you all enjoyed this one as much as I did. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. See ya!